The marathon primary season is almost over. Pennsylvanians just went to the polls, so of course we have to talk about it one more time here on For the Record.
Commonwealth's attorneys and I have concluded that the NCAA sanctions were overreaching and unlawful.
Someone's got to develop a product that you and I, as a consumer, are going to want to buy.
The country needs a comprehensive energy plan.
Good morning and welcome to this edition of For the Record. We are talking post-Pennsylvania and Acela or Amtrak primary results. And to do that, we bring in an expert who previously has been on For the Record, Professor Michael Berkman, the director of the Center for American Political Responsiveness. Professor Berkman, thank you so much for being here again.
Pleasure to be here.
First impressions of what we saw this past Tuesday.
Well, a very good day for the frontrunners. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump both did very well. Donald Trump demonstrated a couple of things I think that are important. He showed that he can break 50% in states outside of New York. He exceeded his polling averages leading up to it, so it was a very good day for Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton pulled away from Bernie Sanders, I think. Obviously, and the other, what also struck me about those primaries was that turnout was very low, and that tells me that the steam is running out of the Stop Trump movement, and that the steam's running out of Bernie Sanders' campaign as well.
Absolutely. Mr. Sanders did have a very passionate rally here in Rec Hall. You take a look at the numbers of what the frontrunners did. Secretary Clinton gaining 202 delegates to Sanders 133. On the Republican side, Trump picking up 100 more with 105. And you see John Kasich picking up the second most over Ted Cruz after their pact. How did you take that pact that they had where you mentioned the Stop Trump movement? Is that good for politics, what those two did?
Well, I don't see any real problem with what they did. I don't think it's particularly effective, and I think it's probably far too late for them really to be thinking about doing this. There's a lot more in it for Cruz than there is for Kasich, and that Indiana is a winner-take-all state. Indiana is really the make-or-break state for Cruz right now. So getting Kasich to somewhat pull out of Indiana is very important for Cruz.
Are you surprised maybe that John Kasich in the Mid-Atlantic areas possibly didn't get more support?
I have been surprised, first of all, that he hasn't gotten more endorsements, that the party establishment just did not get behind Kasich at all. And I also don't think he's run a particularly effective or exciting campaign. He hasn't been very strategic in where he's campaigning. He hasn't really been able to pick up any delegates. He hasn't made big speeches that would make him appear as a more serious and important candidate than he is. I think the whole campaign has just been kind of disappointing. And I have a feeling that Kasich is just out of step with where the Republican Party is right now.
Do you think maybe, and this could be a very broad question, Democrat, Republican side, and maybe the tone and the anger of voters on both sides of the aisle, that maybe he's a little bit past his prime say on what those campaigns would work, or a campaign like his that is throwing out ideas?
Well, I think that somebody like Kasich really shows how the Republican Party has changed in recent years. So, Kasich was a conservative Republican. He was part of the Newt Gingrich vanguard in 1994 that really started to pull the party to the right. He was an important lieutenant of Newt Gingrich in the House of Representatives. But the party has kind of passed him by. And so he kind of appears as almost a moderate now, even though he's pretty conservative on all his positions. And so he just does not have a place in the party the way that he did in the past.
The party passing him by kind of like a freight train in the name of Donald Trump. Can that train even be stopped at the convention? There's been some talk that first ballot delegates, they're not even pledged now. How do you see that?
Well, they are pledged on the first ballot. So the way I tend to look at it is that Donald Trump has to win on the first ballot, or it's unlikely he's going to win. But he is much closer to getting 1237 now than he was previously. I think most of the projections say that he's going to come awfully close to 1237. Even if he doesn't quite get there, the Pennsylvania delegates will come into play because they are formally unpledged, but many of them have committed to Donald Trump. Others have committed to going the direction that their districts went in, and Donald Trump took every county in Pennsylvania.
We'll talk about maybe Pennsylvania's primary rules they're very confusing, so I kind of do want to get into that a little bit later.
We'll try.
Yeah, we'll do our best on that one. I'm glad you said that the delegates are pledged on the first ballot.
Yes.
Curly Hagelund, an RNC standing Rules Committee chairman, he kind of feels that is not the case anymore. Is there something that maybe Trump should fear on the Rules Committee that they're working up behind the curtain?
The Rules Committee is very powerful in the Republican convention, in either convention, because there are no rules for the convention until the Rules Committee makes the rules for the convention. Okay. And so there is a point there that there are, but the rules about pledged delegates, I believe, come from the states. So I don't think that the Rules Committee can determine that they are no longer pledged on the first ballot. There are many other areas in which they have a great deal of power. But you have to remember that most of the seats on the Rules Committee are going to be held by Donald Trump's delegates or by Ted Cruz's delegates. So it's unlikely that they're going to be able to do much that would shut either of the two out.
Is that good for politics? Because on both sides, or on one side, I should say, you have Trump saying, this isn't fair, I'm filing lawsuits in 2 states about this. And then on another side, you have Bernie Sanders people saying, well, he projects a rigged economy or says there's a rigged economy, but then his supporters are saying it's a rigged election process with the superdelegates.
Well, I have a feeling that Bernie Sanders is going to lose on pledged delegates, not on superdelegates. So, and superdelegates are within the Democratic Party only. They tend to be elected officials. They are unpledged, but many have committed to Hillary Clinton. He has talked about trying to get the superdelegates to come over to his side. It seems almost impossible to me that they would go against the winner of the pledged delegates, Hillary Clinton, or the popular vote, Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. But I have a feeling that Hillary Clinton is going to get there even without the superdelegates, and so they won't be an issue. On the other side, what is the question exactly on the Republican side?
The Republican side is Trump with the lawsuits and him not liking how the delegates work.
Well, losers tend to complain, but Trump's winning, so I'm not quite sure what he's complaining about. He's actually done quite well under the rules. I think there were like the Nevada caucuses were pretty raucous, and so there may be some fights to be had about credentials on certain certain state delegations, but overall, I think Trump's making out pretty well under the present rules.
I think he's doing pretty well making a big stink on some minor issues. When we come back on For the Record, we're going to talk a little bit more about Pennsylvania's primary rules and, of course, the results. Welcome back to WHVL's For the Record, talking the Amtrak/Acela primary with Professor Michael Berkman, the director of the Center for American Political Responsiveness. Professor Berkman, that's just kind of a loaded question there about, on both sides, Senator Bernie Sanders being upset with the delegates, Donald Trump being upset with the delegates. Well, he's kind of upset with everything, no matter what's going on. But let's go back to Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. He feels that he's being shut out. We know he talks about a rigged economy, but now there's people saying that the election system in the Democratic primaries is rigged in certain states, how they go through.
Right. So this is a different issue from the superdelegates. Mm-hmm. And I think what was difficult for many of the Bernie Sanders supporters in the New York primary and the Pennsylvania primary and some of these other northeastern primaries, these are old party states, and they tend to have closed primary systems where you have to be a registered Democrat or registered Republican to be able to vote in the primary. A lot of Bernie Sanders supporters are younger. They are independents. They haven't necessarily been doing this very much. And so a system like that, and in Pennsylvania it was especially difficult because you had to register back in October 2015 in order to be able to do this. So it was very challenging for many of the Bernie Sanders supporters. I don't know that he would have won even if the independents were able to vote, but it was not the kind of setting that was very favorable to Bernie Sanders.
Results in Pennsylvania: Clinton 55.6, Senator Sanders 43.6. That is 12 percentage points. That's a large margin to make up in a state. And like you said, voter turnout was very, very low.
Yes, voter turnout was low. And this was always the promise of the Sanders revolution, too, was that he was going to bring all these new voters in and turnout would be high, and that was how they were going to be winning. And he really has not been able to do that. He has not been able to get the turnout numbers, even when turnout was higher. He hasn't been able to get the turnout the rallies would suggest, let's put it that way. And certainly in this last group, the steam just seems to be going out of it. And of course, he has pretty much conceded that he's no longer really playing for the nomination, he's playing for delegates.
The other side, the Republican side, Trump in Pennsylvania. I was out in Pittsburgh on Monday. I saw all Cruz rallies. Every street sign, every stoplight I was at, there were multiple honk for Cruz. Turns out he was pretty much a no-show in the state.
Throughout the entire Northeast, he was a no-show. Cruz just got slaughtered in the Northeast. This is not very friendly country for him. And, I mean, it shows that Cruz is a pretty extreme candidate with a pretty niche kind of following. And so from the perspective of the Republican establishment that would like to stop Donald Trump, Ted Cruz was not really the right person to do it. And they never really got behind Ted Cruz. What I've never really understood is why they didn't get behind Kasich more, but I'm not sure it would have helped.
John Boehner, former Speaker of the House, called him the most miserable SO, and I'll leave the rest of that to...
It's the miserable that really drove it home.
Yeah, definitely on that part. Pennsylvania's primary system. I consider myself informed on politics. I had a hard time figuring out that if I was voting for Donald Trump, who I had to vote for to get his delegates. Can you go into more detail about how this works in Pennsylvania?
Right. So technically, Pennsylvania on the Republican side had 17 pledged delegates that are awarded statewide. But then at the congressional district level, the delegates are officially unpledged, which means that on the first ballot, they are not committed to any particular candidate. However, many of them did previously commit to a candidate, and each of the candidates, I know Trump did, I'm assuming that others did as well, put out voter guides that essentially said, if you want to vote for me, for delegates that are favorable to me, you need to vote for these people. Now, that requires a certain level of sophistication and information for voters, so it's very, very challenging. It is not a very voter-friendly sort of system. So when you get in, you can vote for essentially for the statewide delegates by voting for Donald Trump, but then you have to know who his delegates are. Technically, though, you're voting for unpledged delegates.
Why can't Pennsylvania just have a system that votes and, like you said, Donald Trump won all the counties, whether it's a percentage-wise of the delegates in those districts goes to him at the national convention? Why does it have to be complicated when we have such low voter turnout and we seem to be making things more complicated?
They don't want to. I mean, this is the system they want. And in this election, I have a feeling Pennsylvania Republican delegates are thinking, I'm the most powerful person around, because they're going in unpledged to a convention that still has the potential of being contested. That puts an enormous amount of power in the hands of the unpledged delegates. The largest block of unpledged delegates is coming from Pennsylvania.
Is that right?
Political parties are not governmental organizations. They are private organizations. They get to make their own rules. And political parties in the United States are highly decentralized. It's not really like there's a national Republican and Democratic Party. There are 50 state parties for each one. They all operate under their own traditions. They operate under their own rules. To Pennsylvania Republicans who have been very involved in party politics for many years, I'm sure it feels just fine.
On the Democrats, the superdelegates have been around since the mid-'80s. Really, there was talk in 2008 with President Barack Obama that it would have been an issue. Turned out it didn't. Do you think now that there's an issue on the Republican side, maybe voters somehow convince their party system that it has to change?
Well, I would think if the Republicans lose this election, one thing that they will go back and look at is their system for selecting their nominee. But parties do this all the time. And so superdelegates are probably an appealing idea to the Republican establishment right now. There are many Republican office holders who are thinking, I wish I were going to be a delegate here and that we had a large block of uncommitted delegates who would be able to select somebody who is more electable. Now, that's why the Democrats did it. They weren't that happy with the nomination of Jimmy Carter. They felt like that the party establishment needed to have more say. And so they chose to empower elected officials who do have to run on the ticket with the top of the ticket. And it gave them more power to do so.
Party establishment, that's a dirty word here.
Yeah, I'm talking about elected officials.
Yeah.
Who are different from delegates.
Different from delegates, but the delegates you would think are being harassed just as much as an elected politician is. normally, except without the staff and the offices. We've had horror stories on the Democratic side, and of course on the Republican side in Pennsylvania. People were saying that they were getting phone calls at their place of work. Professor, when we come back, I do want to talk about Secretary Clinton and the matchup with Donald Trump and maybe how that is going to affect independents. You are watching WHVL's For the Record. Welcome back to WHVL's For the Record, talking the Amtrak/Acela primary, whether what beltway you lived in, whatever you want to call it. Either way, the voter turnout was low. There was disorganization, chaos, and of course, the results came in late out of Maryland. But what could you say? It was Amtrak/Acela. It's like a normal day for those guys. Clinton-Trump, that's the way it looks like we're going. 24% of Americans, according to a Rasmussen poll, saying they're going to opt out of the election. How do you see this working?
Well, I would revisit a question like that after the convention because, the supporters of the candidates who did not win have very raw feelings right now. And so the idea of just going over and supporting the person who beat them is not really an easy thing to do. But in the end, partisans tend to come back to their party. It's unusual for partisans to vote for the other party, so we'd have to see about that after the convention when the election is in full swing.
You see the numbers up there on your screen. If Trump is the nominee, according to this poll, 5% say they would stay home, 66% would vote for him, while 10% would vote for Clinton. Flip it over to Secretary Clinton on the other side. 11% of Dems said they would vote for a third party, and 11% say they would vote for the Donald. Mm-hmm. A lot of it, at least on the Democratic side, has to do possibly with Bernie Sanders' tone and rhetoric as the campaign trail continues. How do you think, what's going to be his play? Because it's been pretty much Wall Street speeches and things like that. Do you think he changes it?
I would expect, but of course I don't know for sure, but I would expect that Bernie Sanders is going to tone down the attacks on Hillary Clinton herself, although he'll continue to push the issues and the differences between the two of them. So you'll continue to hear about Wall Street, you'll continue to hear about campaign finance, you'll continue to hear about income inequality. What I suspect you'll hear less about is Hillary Clinton's role in all of that. Could be wrong on that, but I suspect that's where Bernie Sanders is going. And Bernie Sanders has also been very clear on multiple occasions that he has all intentions of working to defeat Donald Trump. And I suspect that means he'll be all in, whatever exactly that's going to mean.
Is that beneficial to Donald Trump that you have people basically just focusing on him and what he's saying rather than focusing on issues? Can that alienate independents who are going to go to the polls?
Well, Donald Trump is very unpopular among independents, especially among independent women. And Donald Trump is a great energizer for many in the Democratic coalition. He's a great energizer for Hispanics. He's a great energizer for African Americans. And I have a feeling he's a great energizer for younger voters who just don't really share a lot of the kind of sexist comments that are coming out of his mouth are just not really what this generation is particularly used to. So I think that Donald Trump is going to be Hillary Clinton's greatest weapon in many ways. That said, he's unpredictable, and he's going to shake up the election in some ways that we haven't seen before. I suspect there will be some voters, white, less educated white voters who are going to go for Donald Trump, who might have either stayed home or gone for Hillary Clinton, or who have been looking at Bernie Sanders for various reasons, who may go over to Donald Trump.
Now, Secretary Clinton, foregone conclusion, I think we all could assume Donald Trump. We've talked a little bit about the convention. How do you see the convention? If you could go to Cleveland, which is funny because it seems like Cleveland always has things like this happen to them, at least in their sports teams, chaos. How do you think when the first vote is called, it's going to play out?
Yeah, I have a feeling that Donald Trump will have the 1237 when he gets there, even if he doesn't have 1237 at the end of the California primary in early June. He has that period from early June to July to collect the extra delegates. And, as we said, I think a lot of the Pennsylvania delegates are pretty well committed to him. There's some others around the country. He may be able to get there. If he doesn't get there, I think Donald Trump needs to win on the first ballot. If he doesn't win on the first ballot, then everything is wide open.
Who's the guy?
Well, I don't know.
Or a woman?
I don't know, because I actually really find it unlikely that Cruz would be the favorite for the delegates on the second ballot.
I could imagine that, yeah.
Because if they're able to get rid of Donald Trump in effect from the party establishment, then they're looking around and thinking, I don't know that Cruz is our best bet to go with. On the other hand, there are going to be a lot of delegates there for Donald Trump and Cruz, and so you're going to have quite a contested scene if they're trying to go to somebody else. But it is not inconceivable that several ballots down the line, if Donald Trump doesn't have it on the first ballot, that they could go to somebody who we haven't really heard from before. Of course, this is Kasich's hope, that because he was in this, that it would be him. Winning 1 out of 50 primaries and caucuses is not going to be the most compelling argument for him to make. But who knows?
Speaker of the House, Ryan, he said no.
Yeah, he said it before.
He said that when he was going to take this the speakership. He said no. Condoleezza Rice, I've heard that name floated out there. I think she's doing pretty well on the football playoff committee and out at Stanford. Who do you think the Republicans could turn to?
Mitt Romney. I mean, it's really hard to, because he's been vetted, he's been through the process, he knows they know he can raise the money. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just guessing. It's very hard for me to imagine where they go to. Paul Ryan seems to me the logical person that you would want to go to. It's good for everybody in the party except Paul Ryan. That's not a very good way to enter the election. A divided party is a disadvantaged party in the election. And I do think that Paul Ryan has presidential ambitions. This is probably not the time to do it.
Probably not the year. Real quick, final thought. 10 seconds. Michael Bloomberg, possibly third party.
Bloomberg has pretty well said that if it's not Bernie Sanders, he's not going to get into the race. I think he's probably comfortable with Hillary Clinton. If I were to anticipate a third party, it's going to come on the right. And that would be, maybe Ted Cruz and Carly Fiorina are going to run as an independent ticket in some states, and the party will be severely fractured. So I do not put it outside the realm of possibility that Republicans would be offered a conservative alternative.
Professor Berkman, thank you very much for stopping by. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching this edition of WHVL's For the Record.